welcome and good morning. Yeah, my name is Cahill Smith. I teach up in Logan. I'm enjoying the warmer weather down here, and I wanted to say, people like Christian and Nancy have made it so much fun to move to Utah and get to know the piano community here. It's not something that I grew up with, where we said yesterday, you can throw a cat out the window in Utah and hit a good pianist somewhere, and also some really wonderful piano teachers, all of you here interested in trying to improve what you're offering to your students. So I'm happy to be here with you today and excited to meet you and hopefully learn something from you as well. So this is going to be kind of a rapid fire presentation with hopefully a few resources and some tips about developing talent, especially towards practicing. It's a subject that we all are experienced in, but I'm especially nerdy about and love to go and study. When I was a student, I was told that, or I assumed, you can't really learn about practicing except by doing it. But actually there are a lot of tremendous resources out there and some new developing research today, especially in the last decade or so, has totally changed the way that I practice as well as the way that I try to train my students to practice. So this will be a little guide for you to try to remember some of the points. I'll have in the slides some words that are underlined and bolded if you want to try to fill them in as we go. I think it's in the right order. And we may run out of time, just a little warning at the end. It's I've tried to keep it under 50 minutes. And Christian's going to wave me down in like 50 minutes, right? Feel free to stop if you got any questions. There's also some time for questions, right? After the second presentation. So happy to be here with you this morning. So what we'll do is I'll start out with a few questions to get us thinking in this direction. We'll talk about practice in the brain, go through some strategies, talk about the habits and mindset of developing talent, and then also at the end a little bit about coaching and mentoring talent. So the kind of main questions for this are some big ones that we're all thinking about all the time. How do you get really, really good at something? How do you develop talent in ourselves and those around us? And how do we make the most progress in the smallest amount of time? These are the questions that we're all asking all the time in the teaching studio. But I wanted to define talent as something that is building a skill rather than learning knowledge, which is a little bit different. The way we train for it is totally different because it involves what we do with our bodies. So I'm going to show a few resources maybe at the end of the presentation, but a lot of this is coming from a book that I have some mixed feelings about, and I wanted to has anyone read this, The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle? So this was a New York Times bestseller. He's a great salesman. So basically what he did in his research is go visit around the world some very highly rated or highly historical talent hotbeds, and those were music studios, sports arenas, so maybe something like training tennis or baseball or soccer. There were also things like math schools, special training programs, SAT prep courses, and even some military special ops training. And he kind of just did research for a few years and took a lot of notes and videos and then tried to distill the similarities between all these places that seemed to train an unusual number of national or international sort of talented people. And he came up with that sort of tagline. You see it on the book. It's great for selling books. Greatness isn't born, it's grown. Here's how. It's maybe not exactly right, and we'll talk about why, but it's a really good way to sell a book. So what he determined was the same between all of these talent hotbeds were the ways that they motivated and inspired the trainees, their lifestyle habits, the physical settings, actually, especially the way that they practice, and then the coaching methods. So that's his tagline. Today, what we know about modern genetics makes that not exactly true. We do know that talent is something that is developed and can be developed in absolutely anyone. So, but we know a little bit more about genetics, that there are some kind of predetermined factors or different elements. So if I had to write the book, and it would not sell as many copies for sure, but I would say talent is mostly grown. Some of it is born. We're not sure how much. It depends. They probably wouldn't sell a lot of books this way, but that's true about what we know about modern genetics today. It's more like genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. You might have heard that before. So this is your first thing on your sheet there, what he kind of distills all of this down into, how you create great talent, how you practice for great talent. Was this recipe is an ignition experience, master coaching, and deep practice. So those are three very different things, and he tries to define them. I'm going to try to define them a little bit. An ignition experience is that thing that maybe inspired you to actually go after that talent or that activity in the first place. You might be thinking of your own, maybe that you went to a concert, or you had an experience maybe with a teacher in a lesson, or maybe you heard some great recording that inspired you to want to learn more and improve. Master coaching is what all of you guys do every week in your teaching studios. And then deep practice, he really defines as being a very specific thing that is quite different for those talent hotbeds. This is the book I would recommend the most if you're only going to get one. It's great. Has anybody got a chance to read this or use this? So glad that you're here to experience this for yourself. This kind of takes all of that research and information and boils it down into some very short and actionable tips that you can use to help your students and help yourself even. And it has a little place for notes in the back. It's fantastic. It's very short. I should have brought a copy with me. It's a little hardbound book. Would totally recommend it. The Little Book of Talent. So the first part of this presentation is about practice and the brain. And I don't know if the audio is going to work. We didn't test this before we started, Christian. Let's see.
So how does practice
Can you hear us from here?
affect the inner workings of our brains? The axons that exist in white matter are wrapped with a fatty substance called myelin. And it's this myelin cover, or sheath, that seems to change with practice. Myelin is similar to insulation on electrical cables. It prevents energy loss from electrical signals that the brain uses, moving them more efficiently along neural pathways. Some recent studies in mice suggest that the repetition of a physical motion increases the layers of the myelin sheath that insulates the axons. And the more layers, the greater the insulation around the axon chains, forming a sort of superhighway for information connecting your brain to your muscles. So while many athletes and performers attribute their successes to muscle memory, muscles themselves don't really have memory. Rather, it may be the myelination of neural pathways that give these athletes and performers their edge with faster and more efficient neural pathways. There are many theories that attempt to quantify the number of hours, days, and even years of practice that it takes to master a skill. While we don't yet have a magic number, we do know that mastery isn't simply about the amount of hours of practice. It's also the quality and effectiveness of that practice. Effective practice is consistent, intensely focused, and targets content or weaknesses that lie at the edge of one's current abilities.
Okay, I know that everyone probably couldn't hear that, so I'm going to try to go back and explain a little bit. Most of the research around myelin before, I would say 20, 25 years ago, was pretty small. There was a period of time in medicine where we thought the substance was inert, or it didn't do anything. It was like your appendix. We just noticed that it kind of grew and we didn't understand its function all the time. But if you couldn't hear the video, myelin is a kind of fatty substance that grows around nerve cells. It's a lot like an electrical cable here. So inside of this, there's some copper wire that's conducting electricity, but around it is a rubber insulator. And what myelin does, essentially, as it grows, is it insulates the nerve cells. Nerve cells are some of the longest cells in the body. They are sometimes single cells. The longest one is that goes from the base of your spine to the tip of your toe there. And it's a single cell, right? It conducts electrical signal using sodium channels, actually physically pushes a charge down the neuron, but it's limited in speed. So what myelin does is it both prevents the signal from decaying or leaking out. In other words, if I ran this electrical signal from here to Logan, it would be a lower charge by the time it got up there because a lot of the signal would leak out just on the way, and it would also be pretty slow without an insulator. So the myelin serves the purpose of preventing that signal decay and also increasing the speed. So I put this little GIF up here. I love this stage in children where they're just sort of figuring out how to walk at first, and this kind of Frankenstein image appears. Children are born without all of the myelin in their nerve cells, both in their brain and their motor neurons. And it develops very rapidly as they're growing. So this is the really being able to see with your own eyes unmyelinated nerves and that kind of lack of coordination. But over time, it does start to develop. So we know that it only grows. In other words, you can't demyelinate. It's a good thing. There are some neurodegenerative disorders where people do demyelinate the nerves, and those are very sad situations. But for most of us, you don't ever demyelinate. And what we know about it is that it grows in response to repeated stimulation. You saw on the video the kind of thickness of that coating getting thicker, right? So if you go and do a dissection on some athletes or really well-trained musicians, and you're able to locate those motor neurons, you won't find that the nerve bundle or the number of motor neurons changes. But you do find that the thickness of this coating or this insulator is much thicker. So that it shows that they're really improving the conduction speed. I meant to mention this before. Unmyelinated neurons conduct that sodium signal about 2 miles an hour, and someone who has kind of maxed out deep practice in athletics or in music is up to 245 miles per hour. So it's an extremely efficient insulator. And really, that's a 12,000% increase in speed. So we know that it grows in response only to repeated stimulation, and it also grows after repeatedly reaching the sweet spot. And that is something that we will talk a little bit about later, but it's that zone of kind of desirable difficulty. If something is much too hard for the repetition, then it doesn't stimulate the growth. And if it's much too easy, there's nothing new, so it certainly doesn't stimulate the growth. For example, a simple study showed that you're more likely to remember the first sentence there because you had to reach to sort of fill in the blanks like I'm making you do on your worksheet. You'll be more likely to remember some of those things than if I just say it to you or if you read it once, right? So what it tells us about practicing is that reaching and failing are biological necessities for learning. It really changes the way you think about treating your students or treating your practice. And we all know the second one from teaching in any piano studio, that unlearning is incredibly difficult. And that is not just because your students are stupid or because they're ignoring you. There is literally a biological clock there for the timing of remyelinating some other pathways. There are billions and trillions of connections actually that route motor neurons. So we know that unlearning is biologically difficult, and that a little bit changes those kind of common sayings that you might have said to your students, practice makes perfect. And then for a while we said, no, practice makes permanent, because whatever you repeat becomes permanent, right? But now we know that it's a little bit more nuanced, that practice makes myelin, and myelin makes permanent whatever you repeat. So the first kind of tip there with this, because we know at the rate that it grows, by the way, it grows mostly when you're sleeping. That's the time that it is developing. It grows very, very slowly. It's not like muscle tissue or even nerve tissue. It grows extremely slowly. But it takes time, no matter who you are. You probably noticed that most of those kind of training camps that Dan Coyle visited had a kind of link. Even the special ops, chess clubs, tennis clubs, they tend to have training programs or modules that were 6 to 8 weeks in length, because they could really see a tremendous change in that amount of time. And I certainly notice when I'm practicing for a concert, the work that I do this week does not matter pretty much at all, but I'm practicing kind of for a month or 6 weeks ahead. That's when you really start to see the results of what you did in a technical way, right? Musically, we can get a lot of improvement with cram practicing and the things that we can do on the day of, but usually for building technique and performance art, it's happening 6 weeks before, right? So set goals with your students of maybe 6 to 8 weeks for learning new hard skills or technique. The second one is to think like a gardener and work like a carpenter. That's a really simple image to remember that talent grows slowly. I did a little bit of gardening last summer. I'm a novice at it, but I wouldn't plant a tomato bush and then walk outside the next day and just rip the thing out of the ground because it wasn't already producing fruit. Those things take time, and it's very similar with building motor connections and coordination for students. So I would just recommend you consider doing something like making progress videos and watch them together with your students, especially getting up into the intermediate levels. It's hard for students to see those changes from day to day, and they get frustrated, but they can absolutely see them 6 weeks difference just with something simple like scales or arpeggios. So what is deep practice? That thing he said was part of the talent code. I would define it as these things. It means it's intensely focused, though there are minimal distractions. It is multiple intense sessions followed by periods of rest, and those periods of rest for building myelin are absolutely essential. It's important to take breaks that are strategic. I know Itzhak Perlman's formula is to do 40 minutes of deep practice, 10 minutes of running through a piece to reincorporate it, and then 10 minutes of rest afterwards. And that usually looks like, not walking for him, but he would suggest to take a walk to do something that gets your head out of the practicing. It also means quality repetitions of one chunk. I wrote SAP there. That means smallest achievable perfection. Sometimes that's just 2 notes with a student, but it's multiple quality repetitions of that chunk, whatever it is, at the sweet spot. It starts slowly, gradually increases in speed. Most of us know that. And it also involves mental practice. So that's another creepy study, is that you can actually build some myelin from mental practice. Once the student or the trainee, he used the example of a tennis serve in some tennis training camp in Russia. They had the novice tennis players watch the serves of some of the pros. And after practicing, just watching them later over a period of time also develop the skill and can produce and grow more myelin. So doing intense kind of visual practice and mental practice does help. So we're in this kind of second part here about some practice strategies. There are a lot of strategies here, so I wanted to start with this one. If you feel overwhelmed by any of this, this is kind of the meta rule for choosing which practice strategy to use or to think about experimenting with your students or in your own practice. And that is to use this REPS, R-E-P-S, that's what you remember. So you're asking a question, does this practice strategy require me to reach for something that I haven't done before? If yes, then you're good. Is it engaging? Meaning, does this practice strategy force you to focus on what you're doing and keep you from thinking about what you're having for dinner that night? Right? I'm always thinking about food while I'm practicing. It's terrible. That's when I know I'm not practicing well, is because I'm thinking about, what am I going to eat next meal? It's purposeful, as in it has a specific reason that you're practicing it. Maybe you have a section of a piece where you can't quite get that 4th finger timing on the cross to be on time, so you're practicing specifically to create a rhythm drill to get that to come a little bit earlier. And does it give you strong, speedy feedback? So does it tell you immediately if you got the thing right or wrong, or the way you want it to sound? That's why running through pieces hundreds of times often doesn't help so much, because we don't get immediate feedback on the change that we're trying to make. So that's the kind of overarching strategy to choose a practice strategy, I would say, because there are a lot of them, and it can be overwhelming to think about incorporating them all at the same time. This is one that really changed my teaching, especially. And it's before practicing, figure out if what you're doing is a hard skill or a soft skill, because they're trained completely differently, and we have to be aware of that when we're working with students. Hard skills are things that we always want to be the same every time that we do them, something that we want to be consistent and reliable each time despite changing circumstances. So in piano playing, I would say that we follow the ABCs, or always be consistent, with hard skills. And those are things like posture and position, right? Regardless of the instrument or the venue or the piece, you don't want to generally see a lot of changes in posture, right, of a pianist. We don't sit like this for Bach, well, maybe we do it for Glenn Gould. We sit like this for Bach and like this for Rachmaninoff, right? Those are things that we always want to be consistent because they have a kind of advantage, maybe physically. It's things like technique. Technique is a loaded word. I define that as the way you move your body to get the sound that you want, or purposeful movement for musical ends is technique. Fingering, those are things we don't want to necessarily change every time we play a piece, hopefully. Memorization, that's a hard skill. It can only be one way, right? We want to memorize exactly the way that we want to perform it. And something like transposition, right? It's either right or wrong. Pregnant or not pregnant, I say to my students sometimes, it's the right note or wrong note. Soft skills, on the other hand, are totally different, right? Those are the things that we're trying purposefully to build adaptation into the practice method. So those are things that we want to be flexible with all the time. And those are things like improvisation, composition or arranging, obviously. Interpretation, right? Emotionally connecting a piece to the audience, that should be different and fresh every time you do it. Ensemble and collaborative skills, those are things that cannot be hard because they're changing depending on what your partner does. You have to be able to sense what they're doing with timing and with balance. And something like sight reading. Sight reading is a perfect example of a soft skill where you can't train it to be the same every time because the music is always changing. For those skills, we think about the method of practicing them as read, react, and recognize, or read, recognize, and react. So RRR for soft skills, ABCs for hard skills. And then when we're training those, go back to that carpenter analogy. To build hard skills, we want to work like a careful carpenter. So you imagine someone, we have a wonderful ceramics shop in our arts college up in Logan, and I've got to be friends with a couple of the faculty. What they do in some ways is a lot harder than what we do, because if they make a significant mistake on something, they might need to start all over again, right? Well, if you think about, creating a marble bust of Beethoven or something, and at first you're taking off big chunks of rock. If you suddenly chop off the block that would become his nose, you have to start over with a new piece of marble, or decide to do something else with the rock. So with hard skills, those things that we mentioned before, these kind of things that we want to be consistent all the time, the top bullet point is the most important. The repetition for those skills comes last, right? You probably know that when you're working with your students. I'm guilty of this because there are a couple of practice rooms in our school where I can hear what my students are doing, and I've been known to sometimes save them from themselves. Just stop, or maybe practice another piece and let's get together later this week, because I can hear that maybe what they're repeating is going to be harder to unlearn a little bit later. So with hard skills, we want to make sure we know exactly what it is that we want to do with our bodies or with the sound before we start repeating it. That means we want to break down really complex motions into simple components and understand and practice them first. Usually with hard skills, we're looking at a fewer number of quality repetitions. And if I'm trying to make a change in my music when I'm playing, my rule is 7 times. If I can do the new thing 7 times the way that I really want to hear it, then I'm good to go, then I'll move on. Sometimes with students, I'm great if it's 2 or 3, because it means it wasn't luck, right? To build soft skills, you want to think of like playing like a skateboarder, right? So I don't skateboard, but I do enjoy watching skateboarders at a skate park sacrifice themselves and their pride for these tricks. It's pretty amazing. So a skateboarder is essentially looking at the skate park and thinking, okay, I think I can come down the ramp here, do this little jump and land on that rail and not fall on my face. And I'm going to try it, right? And so with that kind of skill, much like sight reading for us, the goal is to really to just jump right in and do it. So, and those kinds of skills, repetition has to come first before we start analyzing it or thinking about it or what we want to change. And you probably noticed this. Does anybody teach improvisation in your studio? Live teaching improv? Christian's the only one? Oh, totally would recommend it. It's a really fun thing for classical pianists especially to do every day. I've had a lot of students that are paralyzed with improvisation, but finding ways to get them in, doing it in a simple way first is very important. You don't want them analyzing it or worrying about making mistakes. The way we build those skills is just doing it constantly. It's the same for sight reading. What he also noticed, Dan Coyle, visiting all these talent hotbeds, is that all of them had an emphasis on the hard skills over the soft skills. It depends on your studio philosophy and what you're trying to teach, but he said that all of those places usually prioritize the hard skills. That's a big one. So the sweet spot, I've mentioned it a couple of times. I like to think about going in my pantry. I'm always thinking about food. It's food again. But if I'm thinking about going in my pantry to get some ingredients, there's this shelf right here, right, which might be, salt, spices, all that kind of stuff, which is not difficult for me to reach at all. And then there's on the top shelf some rare things that I've almost never used, like maybe some saffron or something silly like that, which I'm probably going to go get a chair to get to reach it. And it's out of my reach. I'd have to jump up to try to get it. But there's also the shelf just above those where if I just stand on my tiptoes and kind of reach around, I might be able to get that thing out. That is where I would say good practicing exists. You want to try to stay in that zone and keep your students in that zone for the longest time to get the most progress in the smallest amount of time, right? That's challenging. It's exhausting. I think really good practicing, you really feel wiped out. For me, it's about 40 minutes, and I know I'm done. If it's excellent, high-quality practicing at that sweet spot. You could also define it, that top bullet point, that's what Dan Coyle calls it, the uncomfortable burn of almost, right? The uncomfortable burn of almost. He said it's almost like a physical sensation. You're trying something new in the practice room, maybe it's just a little bit faster on that, like we're trying to get something a little bit cleaner, or make just slightly bigger crescendo in a moment, and you just can almost do it if you focus all of your efforts on it. That's where you want to live in the practice room. And you could define this in terms of accuracy as well. He says that the comfort zone is 80% and above. That's this shelf right here. That means pretty much every repetition I'm not struggling to get the new thing, and it's really consistent. That's good as we get closer to performance or something like that. The sweet spot is in that 50 to 80% accuracy, so you're trying for something new, maybe half the time, not getting it. Below 50%, that's the very top shelf, and that's not great practicing either. That's what I call piñata practicing. Blindfold on, swinging around, and missing it most of the time. That's not a good place to be in practicing. That's a quote from Einstein, to develop skill, to develop an instinct for what can be just barely achieved through one's greatest effort. I thought this was really fascinating. Does anyone use the app Piano Marble? Here's like a Utah thing. I'm generally technology averse and I'm very old-fashioned in teaching, but I have to say I love that sight reading assessment on there. I think it is incredibly powerful, and I've seen my students dramatically increase their sight reading skills through using that. And it follows a very similar formula for this sweet spot, right? So it gives your student an excerpt. It assesses just notes and rhythms, that's all it's helping them with. And if they're above 80% accuracy, it gives them something slightly harder. So what a good teacher would do if you're picking sight reading excerpts, right? So picking something that's just a little bit more difficult than that. If they get below 50%, then it gives them something slightly easier or backs off a little bit, right? And then it's kind of like 3 strikes you're out, right? If you do it 3 times, then it gives you a score and you go from there. Break everything down into chunks. Most of us know that, but generally in practicing, we're looking at a large whole, and then we find something we want to change or that we don't like, and so we go zoom in onto the part, and then we go back and reintegrate it into the whole. That's what great practicing is like. So we're asking ourselves, what is the smallest single element of this skill that I can master? I tell my students sometimes that great musicians, they're like great photographers. They have an amazing zoom lens, right? They can work on something in a big piece and quickly zoom down into a very small section, maybe a measure, and then maybe even go deeper and look at 1 or 2 notes and find the problem, and then quickly zoom back out and reintegrate it. Every time you practice, try to build one perfect chunk. That's something I still have a hard time getting through to my students, that if you're feeling lost and practicing, it really doesn't matter how much time you're putting into it necessarily, but if you're actually inflecting a change. So practice is productive if there's just one thing that you actually changed or did the way that you wanted it to sound. So it doesn't matter really how small that is. That's what we call it, as the smallest achievable perfection, or the SAP. John Wooden, a famous coach, said that never mistake mere activity for accomplishment. A lot of students practice but don't actually change anything. They're playing the piano and not practicing because they haven't built one new chunk or new perfect chunk. Precisely identify mistakes right after they happen. He noticed this, I think I want to say it was with the chess club, that they were forced to kind of notice the mistake quickly and find a way to improve it or get out of it. So for us in practicing, mistakes are the guideposts for improvement. If we don't make them, then we don't have any way to get better. But we want to identify them and then design a way to deal with them. And I would say for your students, try to guide your tone so that you take mistakes seriously but not personally. It's not about the person. After your first perfect rep, freeze. Now that's very important. When you're trying the new thing and you finally get it to sound the way that you want it to, it's very important to stop right then and think about it, not to just try it immediately. Again, most of us have the reflex, I call it the hey, look at me reflex, right? You do it right and then you try to do it immediately again, faster or louder maybe. So, but try to take a moment just to freeze and assess what really happened. I love this video. I hope it'll work.
I'll hit a ball, and the first thing to watch is what starts first from the top of the plane.
This is not a slow motion video. Now it's in slow-mo. Probably the most beautiful fundamental golf swing on the internet there. But yeah, so when we tell our students to practice slowly, they often don't understand how slow that is exactly. They might take a little edge off the tempo. I like to work with my students and give them kind of percentages in their tempos for their practice to make sure they really are doing something new. So I might ask them something like, tell me the ideal performance tempo you'd like to take in this piece. We'll write that number down. And then we'll say, I love to practice at 85%, 50%, and then something ridiculous like 30% of that tempo to really make sure that they understand fingering, movement concepts, and how to practice at those speeds. Does anyone use the word drills in your teaching? In a drill, I use it all the time still. I try to stop. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But skills improve faster when there's fun, connectedness and passion. So the talent code recommends turning all of your drills into some kind of game. So does anybody, I'm just curious, because I always learn from this slide, giving this to teachers. Does anybody have great games like this that you play in your studio? Something that you count? Can you share?
There's one called Bang.
Bang.
Yeah. And then there's
Bang, not bang.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, and?
So you draw rhythms out of a box.
Right.
And then you keep practicing them until you draw a bang and then you're done.
Oh.
But my kids ask for it all the time.
Okay, it's like a draw game, so they have a
Yeah.
chance of having stuff. Great. Anybody else have any other games that you use? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you over there. Yeah.
I'm way in the corner.
Yeah. You're so
The
far
Practice
away.
Revolution, I think it's by Philip Stevens,
Okay.
is full of some really great games, but all of them are essentially the idea of you versus the student. And if they repeat a passage the way that you ask them to, they get points, or they get to place a
Oh,
tic-tac-toe or something like that.
Yes.
And if they do it incorrectly, you get the points, but they have to
Win them back.
win them back by
Yes.
repeating it.
Okay, that's a great game, because studying psychology, we know that the student are more likely to protect points that they've already earned than they are to want to earn new ones. I love that game. So yeah, anything that you can count, you can turn into kind of a game. It doesn't always even have to be competitive. Sometimes it's just them facing themselves. You ever use a little bead counter? I sometimes use Skittles on the on the fall board here for just counting reps. You know, if they want to do 4 in a row, that's the right way. If it's with each rep that moves over, if they get the 4th one back in the old way, they all go back to this side. And that tends to move students into that kind of not struggle zone, the sweet spot, where they're really, really focusing to try to get 4 reps exactly the same way. And then they eat all the Skittles at the end. That's a fun reward. So these are some other ideas. Playing games with metronome speed, the number of pages that they might have memorized, counting perfect reps, that kind of thing. The top example here is what we would call blocked practice, and the bottom one is sometimes called interleaved practice. Anybody heard of that before? Or random practicing, sometimes it's called. There doesn't always have to be an order to that. This one is so powerful, I can't recommend it enough. Certainly in my own experience practicing, and also for my students, I've seen it be just a huge game changer for intermediate and advanced students. So let's imagine that this is, 3 pieces. They have their Bach and their Mozart and their Chopin, and that's how we tend to usually practice. We play the piece, and then we'll try it again, and it gets a little bit better, and then by the 4th time we're feeling pretty good, and it's sounding great, and then we stop and we switch. What's wrong with that? Or I'll say maybe what's different between that and what we have to do in a performance?
You get one shot.
Thank you. Thanks for saying the obvious thing. Because usually the first time is what we hear in the performance. And so we're defeating our ability to form strategies to do it the right way the first time. That's what I still love about live music playing, is it's such an intensely difficult task to play it the way you want it the first time. I still don't know how to do that. I'm trying to figure it out. But the second kind of practice really, really helps with that. So that's the Bach, and then the Chopin, and then the Mozart. And maybe they're just the difficult passages. I really believe that good practicing, 90% of the practice time is on maybe 10% of the music, right? There are a few spots that usually take the most time to build. So alternating between them this way yields substantially more progress. And there are dozens of scientific studies in sports and in music and language learning, actually, that have proven this to be true over a period of weeks. So if you do this in one practice session, the warning is you will feel terrible. The top way, remember, it's really great for building motivation, because the last time that you play something, you're feeling great about it. So you leave the practice room feeling, yes, but then you sit down and play for your teacher, and then you have that famous comment, it sounded so much better in the practice room, right? Well, of course it did, because that was the 6th time that you played it, and it got better each time. Or my favorite, you guys are gonna see a master class later today. It's always better when the student tries it the second time. it's not going to be because of anything that I say most of the time. I've always admired that in master classes. Teacher can say anything, and a student plays, they're very nervous, and then they say, well, this passage is like nailing Jell-O to a tree. And then they play it the second time, and it's better. And the audience goes, it's better the second time. So, anyways, it won't be because of anything that I say to do later. But the second way here, this interleave practice, generally feels terrible. You feel like you're not making a lot of practice in the session, because each time you approach that excerpt, you're having to really focus and think, oh, I'm really going to watch my thumb position there, and you're trying to nail it the first time. Over a couple of days, this kind of practicing means a lot more progress, and over weeks it's not even comparison to something like double the progress, just with things that you can measure in music, like tempo, memorization, technique. The second way is definitely the fastest. So choose interleaved or random practice instead of blocked. This next one, how am I doing on time? Doing okay? Okay, 7 minutes, something like that. This one he learned from a soccer team. I want to say it was Spain. But the tip is to shrink the space, and that therefore concentrates the reach. Most of us do this by assigning things like exercises or etudes for students that study a specific kind of motion or maybe musical problem. But in soccer, he found that the team that was #1 that year, one thing they were doing differently than all the other teams preparing for the World Cup was they had their regular practice or their sort of regular rehearsal, but they also set aside about 30 minutes every day where they split all of the team members into very small rooms. I'm talking about like a bathroom size, very small. And they had to play keep away from just one other person, like we're just here to just try to control the ball. And someone was keeping track of the time. It was a competitive thing to see who could hold on to the ball for the longest. And in that intense space, their ball control improved much faster than playing on the giant field, right, where you got to kick the ball 100 yards and then gather it. So I believe in this firmly in my own practicing and working with students, that the fastest way to really overcome technical challenges or even musical ones is to try to find a way to create an exercise out of the passage. It takes a little bit more thought. And I always keep a pad of blank staff paper right there in the studio to write down an exercise for them that they can repeat quickly instead of playing through the music. I should give examples for all of these, but I'm sure you can imagine some of them in your own repertoire. But shrink the space and concentrate the reach. This was a common tip in almost all sports, but also in music, to close your eyes. So we know that we get a kind of a boost to our other senses when we lose others. So especially for things like memory training and performance training, closing your eyes can be really disconcerting at first. There's one room that I love in our music building there because it's completely dark. There's no windows anywhere. And there I can practice really in complete darkness without seeing the keyboard at all and not having to wear a blindfold or something like that. And this improves kinesthetic sense, the sense that we all have for motion and touch dramatically. So I would always advise telling your students, especially as they're getting ready for concerts or even practicing something new and technical, to try it without looking. And I often show videos of some of my favorite blind pianists to students for their technique. Some of my favorites are Art Tatum. If you like this pianist, he has unbelievable fingers and technique. I wish I could play like that guy. He's totally blind since birth. Another is Tsuji Nobuyuki, this gold medalist at Van Cliburn competition. Did anybody see this pianist play? Okay, I should write his name down because it's a little hard to spell. Let's see if this works. There we go. Japanese pianist. He was also blind from birth and learned all of his technique and music from rote, just as teacher would give him play the right hand parts, play the left hand parts. Obviously a very special brain and talented individual. But it's fun to watch his technique and movement at the piano because he's never been told by a bad teacher like me how to move his hands or arms. He just does it based on the sound and based on how he has to get there. It's incredibly fluid and efficient technique. He doesn't waste any motion. You never see these kinds of things. He's just absolutely incredibly clear. So, as I mentioned before, I'm going to give you some resources, and if I don't get to it, on the back of this sheet is a list of resources that I recommend if you're interested in studying this field further. But to learn from a book, close it is the idea. So, you can imagine two different ways of kind of studying for an exam. This is probably the one slide that's about building knowledge rather than skill, but that's important for piano students too, because often we want them to learn things like music theory or music history. When you're studying something that is knowledge-based, or where you have to recall certain facts or ways of thinking, it's the purposeful recall that creates memory or makes it stick with you. It's not reading it over and over again. You can any students in here, college students? Okay, so you can imagine getting ready for that horrible biology exam. You've got two different ways to study. One is you can read the chapter 4 times in a row and then go take the exam. The other is you can read a small part of it and then try to write a summary without looking at the book, right? Or write down some bullet points that you remember. That second way is much more likely to prepare you for the test because you're actually having to recall the information, not to see it again. That comes from Peter Brown's book. It's called Make It Stick. That's another really great one. If you want to learn how to learn anything faster, that's a book I would totally recommend. This next one is about time. And I always say this to my students. I have one just delightful 12-year-old boy who just told me he really hated practicing. And I was like, oh, it's so sad. So I asked him, how much practice do you want to do this week? And he said, well, I don't know, like 3 minutes a day, something like that. I said, okay, we'll work with that. And so I made a plan for him exactly what to do with his repetitions in those 3 minutes every day. And I'm not kidding, his next week lesson was one of the best that he had, just because of having something very specific to do in a short amount of time. I hope it didn't encourage him to practice 3 minutes a day after that, but he did improve, and he thought that was very funny. So practice for 5 minutes a day over 1 hour per week. 5 minutes a day is only 35 minutes, but it's the regularity and the purposeful recall over a period of time that builds talent and makes myelin grow for movement. So it's superior even though it's less time. So when I was a college student, I was recommended to practice 4 hours a day, and I thought that meant go sit in a practice room for 4 hours and don't leave. And that was horrible. It's like the slowest way to build skills. It's much better to have 3 or 4 blocks of 30 or 40 minutes, even though it's less time. You get much more retention and improvement. This is a pretty famous study now, I think, in music. It was an actual kind of practice study. Has anybody heard of this one or read it before? University of Texas Systems? It's great. I love to show this to students if they ever argue with me about how practicing should go. This is a fascinating study, but it took a lot of pianists and kind of put them in an experiment room. They gave them this little excerpt of a Shostakovich concerto. It's about time to wrap it up. Thank you. I'll try to skip ahead. They gave them this little excerpt of a Shostakovich piano concerto, and they said, please learn this. And they didn't put a limit on their time. They said, you can take as long as you need to learn it. They gave them a pencil and a metronome. And they video recorded their entire practice session so they could analyze it later. The next day, they were kind of isolated from the piano and not allowed to practice. And they came back the next day and did a retention test where they had to play the excerpt 10 times in a row, and then the examiners counted every wrong note, every wrong rhythm, every start and stop, every stutter, and quantified all that into some data. And it was fascinating, because it showed with data all those things that we try to tell our students about practicing. I guess it's a green arrow. I'm colorblind. Is it yellow? I'm not sure. It's green. Okay, that one there is the student that I want to be, because he practiced a total in the practice session 711 seconds. Not very much at all. but his retention test score was excellent. It was still up in the 80% over there. The second student on the kind of performance rating practiced much more, but got a little bit of a higher score. The red arrow is the student that I absolutely don't want to be. They practiced longer than anyone else, but still scored quite low on the test. Kind of the main point of this study was the title, is that it's not how much, it's how, right? But that study really showed that there's absolutely zero correlation between the amount of time that you spend and the results in a retention test. It's not about time. There's a kind of a bare minimum time that you need to get into the room and open the piano and open your books and all that kind of stuff. But when it comes to actually getting successful practice, the most important factor was not time or even the total number of reps. They also counted how many repetitions the students did. But that had no correlation with their success in the next day. So it was not about the time, it was not about the number of reps, it was about the proportion of complete, correct repetitions to the total repetitions or the incorrect repetitions, right? It's common sense, I mean, when you think about it, because your brain is remembering whatever you repeat and you're building myelin to kind of insulate those motor pathways. The number of repetitions that you get the right way compared to the total number is going to be the results of good practicing, right? So pretty amazing stuff. Okay, I'm going to have to jump probably to the end here. These are some great ones, but I'll just come see you maybe during lunch, and if you want to fill in the last of your blanks there. Yeah, these are very quick, I hope. Let's see. The first one, this is kind of the first tip in the talent code. The thing that he noticed was the most in common of all of these talent op-eds, is that he saw this kind of face all of the time. And if you're seeing that kind of face in your teaching studio or when you're practicing with your students, that's good. So he noticed that was kind of that starting that ignition experience, but he calls it staring at who you want to become. That's not just kind of, a vacant stare, but it's the kind of stare that you see in a young infant when they're surprised by something, or in maybe a hungry cat, you take out the food for the first time. The way that they're focused in on it is unlike anything else. It's intense focus. And then the student is hopefully asking, if they can do it, why can't I do it? Spending 15 minutes per day engraving. And that's a little bit to do with mental practice, but also having the student really intensely watch the activity before trying to do it themselves. I really believe that modeling for your students on new concepts or motions is very, very important. And don't be afraid to do it several times and just have them watch intensely. You can draw their attention to sound or certain motions and have them do it, kind of air piano it before they actually go and sit down and do it. The main reason is that actually performing the activity takes, piano playing, it's more motor commands per second than any other sport or musical instrument, so that takes 100% of your brain space. But actually watching someone else do it, you can learn a lot without having to spend that brain space of doing the activity for yourself. I'm going to skip this one. This one is important. I just wanted to reinforce this one because I find it's one of the things that students lack the most. He noticed that every single one of these talent hotbeds had some way to offload goals and information into a written form. So if you don't encourage your students to keep some kind of rudimentary practice journal, I would highly advise it because I see major progress with the students. It doesn't have to be complicated, but it's basically those things. Results from today, what went well or what did not get done, ideas for tomorrow, what's kind of going up first in your priorities, and then what are the goals for next week, like thinking a little bit larger timeline. There are beautiful ones like this that you can find online for free that are fun and give a little blank space for your students to write in. Mine is less beautiful. Mine's the one there on the right. And that was during grad school. I can remember because I was preparing Opus 111, the last Beethoven sonata there, and You can see where it says extra focus on measure 84. That's in the middle of the fugato with this impossible place for polyphony. But you can see also I did my singer accompaniment at the very end of the session too, because I didn't care about them very much. But a practice journal could be something really simple of keeping track of repetitions or tempo goals, something like that. Okay, and then something for a little positive encouragement, but also to think about some unorthodox teaching. But he saw that in all of those special talent hotbeds, that even the kind of intermediate students were doing some kind of teaching or sharing with the beginner students. And that created this very important feedback loop. You probably notice in your own teaching that when you try to explain a concept to a student, it becomes much more clear to you, and you suddenly realize maybe how you want to work on that subject. But even having your students do a little bit of teaching, giving comments in a group class, or have them reteach something back to you in a lesson can be a great way to have them solidify the concept. If they have to verbalize it or show it or explain it to you, they know it so much better. So I'm changing another one of these sayings. Those who can't do, teach. You ever heard that before? I completely disagree with that. Doers who teach, do better. That's a better way to think of it. Okay, I think I'm probably going to stop there just because I'm out of time and see if we have 2 minutes for questions. Is that okay?
Steel claws at the end of spaghetti noodles. Can you explain that?
Where was it?
Steel claws at the end of spaghetti noodles.
Why don't we wait for the technique hour to talk about that one?
Okay.
It's a little bit more about
We will get to
posture
that,
and
okay.
position. Yeah. Any questions or comments about any of this material? I'm sorry I ran out of time. There's too many tips.
Since I may just need as much time as we did earlier to
Set
my
up.
stuff,
Let me just
maybe I'll try to set up my stuff and you guys can ask questions during that time.
Let me see if I can disconnect from it. How do I do that? Stop
So
sharing.
don't mind the technical difficulties.
It did. Just like that. Okay, great. I'll get out of the way.
I leave the floor for your
Okay,
questions.
yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, how do you get students to buy into this? Because I think a lot of students think they know the right way to practice, and some of them may come from bad habits or whatnot, but what do you find is the most motivational way to get them to buy into these practice habits?
I'd say the first one is to really make sure that they are informed. It's a lot of information that we have out there on it. So when I get a new student, like a transfer student or someone who just starts in my studio, the first lesson is not for the student, it's for the parents. It's a mandatory first lesson where I give them some of this information and a little guide about practicing and how they can really help to enforce those things depending on their age. So that's the first thing. You definitely get the parent involved. Consider like a parent master class where you maybe get all of the parents in the studio together and give some information, like the things that have worked well for you or your students that would be good. The second one is don't overwhelm them too. Pick one practice strategy only for the week and say, I want you to really focus on this every single day with all the music that you're practicing. I just had a lesson last week with a student who's learning he's learning Mozart A minor. And I had him just only on one habit, which was when you're making a mistake and you stop, don't start on the mistake. That's what we all do. Most of the time our ears just want to hear the correct notes, so we just replay it. But often the mistake came from a transition or something before it. So I just had him, that's the only thing you're going to focus on this week. And he made tremendous progress just from working on that one kind of practice habit. It's a little bit of a different thing because there's practicing, but then there's thinking about how to practice better, which is what most of this information is on. So I'd say don't overwhelm them with information.
It's like
And
metacognition.
it is, no,
Teaching them to think.
that's exactly the right word. Yes, it is a metacognitive activity because you're thinking about how to improve your thinking or how to improve your finding solutions for a problem, right? Which is the hardest thing because you have to kind of think outside of yourself and stop from doing your natural reaction to it. So, any other questions? Okay, I hope it's helpful and looking forward to Okay.
I may have a question.
Do you want to try to use mine?
Because I have to grade out,
Click
download
click
the-
this. Click that. Yes. Hey, got it.
Well, thanks so much. You even helped with me, so thank you.